When I was 14, my family moved to a small town in the middle of nowhere. It was one of those places where everyone knew everyone and nothing ever really happened. My parents had bought an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, and while it needed a lot of work, it had this charm that made it feel like home. The only problem was how isolated it was. Our closest neighbors were about a mile down the road, and the house itself was surrounded by dense woods. One night, my parents had to drive into the city for an emergency meeting, leaving me and my younger brother, Jake, home alone. They promised they'd be back by midnight, and since I was used to babysitting Jake, I didn't think much of it. We ordered pizza, watched a movie, and by 10 p.m., Jake was asleep on the couch. I stayed up, scrolling through my phone, waiting for my parents to get back. Around 11:30, I heard a noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind. It was a cold, blustery night, and the trees were swaying like crazy. But then I heard it again. Like something had hit the side of the house. I froze, my heart pounding. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Crunching on the gravel driveway. I peeked out the window, but it was pitch black outside. The motion sensor light by the garage hadn't turned on, which was strange, because it usually went off if so much as a cat walked by. I grabbed my phone and called my dad, but it went straight to voicemail. I was about to call 911 when I heard the front door handle jiggle. My stomach dropped. I shook Jake awake and whispered for him to be quiet. He was groggy at first, but when he saw the fear on my face, he immediately snapped to attention. We both listened as the handle jiggled again, followed by a soft knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing. I thought about grabbing a knife from the kitchen, but I didn't want to leave Jake alone. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then we heard the sound of footsteps again, this time moving around the side of the house, toward the back door. I grabbed Jake's hand and pulled him upstairs to my parents' room. I locked the door and called 911, whispering to the dispatcher that someone was trying to break into our house. She told me to stay calm and that help was on the way. As we waited, we heard the back door creak open. Whoever it was, they were inside. Jake was trembling, and I could feel my own hands shaking as I held onto him. We heard footsteps downstairs, moving slowly through the kitchen and into the living room. Then they started coming up the stairs. Each step creaked under the weight of whoever or whatever was coming toward us. I held my breath, clutching Jake tightly. The footsteps stopped right outside the bedroom door. There was a long pause, and then the handle began to turn. I don't know how I found the courage, but I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a lamp from the nightstand, and stood in front of Jake, ready to swing if the door opened. But just as the handle clicked, we heard sirens in the distance. The footsteps retreated quickly, thundering down the stairs and out the back door. By the time the police arrived, whoever it was had vanished into the woods. They searched the area, but found nothing. No footprints, no evidence, nothing. The police stayed with us until my parents got home, and they suggested we install a security system. But what stuck with me the most was what one of the officers said before he left. He told us that a few months earlier, there had been reports of a man sneaking into homes in the area, watching people while they slept. He'd never been caught. To this day, I don't know who was in our house that night or what they wanted, but I do know this. I've never felt truly safe in that house since, and every time I hear a noise outside, I can't help but think back to that night, wondering if they'll ever come back. When I was in high school, my best friend Sarah and I used to spend weekends at her grandparents' cabin in the woods. It was an old, cozy place, surrounded by tall pines and miles of nothing but wilderness. Her grandparents rarely used it anymore, so they let us stay there whenever we wanted a getaway. It was our little escape from the world, and we loved it. One Friday night, we drove up to the cabin as usual. It was already dark by the time we arrived, and the air was crisp and cold. We unpacked our stuff, made some hot chocolate, and settled in for a night of movies and junk food. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night and went to bed. I was almost asleep when I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the living room. At first I thought it was just the wind rattling the windows, but then it got louder. It sounded like someone was tapping on the glass. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. Sarah was in the room across the hall, so I quietly got up and went to her door. "Sarah," I whispered, "do you hear that?" She opened the door, looking half asleep but concerned. "Hear what?" Before I could answer, the tapping stopped. We both stood there in silence, listening. Then we heard it again. This time, it was coming from the back door. Sarah grabbed a flashlight from her nightstand, and we crept downstairs together. The cabin was pitch black, except for the beam of the flashlight, and every creak of the floorboards made my skin crawl. When we reached the living room, the tapping stopped again. Ting stood there for what felt like forever, holding our breath. Ting-sten. Then we heard something even worse. A soft rhythmic scratching sound, like someone was dragging their fingernails across the door. Sarah's face went pale. "What the hell is that?" I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing. We didn't have cell service out there, and the landline phone was in the kitchen. I was about to suggest we call for help when the scratching stopped, and we heard footsteps on the porch. Sarah shined the flashlight toward the window, but the beam didn't reach far enough to see anything. We heard the footsteps move around the side of the house, and then they stopped right outside the living room window. That's when we saw it, a face. It was pressed against the glass, staring right at us. I couldn't make out many details, but I could see the outline of a man's face, his eyes wide and unblinking. Sarah screamed and dropped the flashlight, plunging us into darkness. We bolted upstairs and locked ourselves in her room. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold onto my phone, but I managed to turn on the flashlight app. We pushed a dresser in front of the door and sat on the bed, listening. For a while, there was nothing. No tapping, no scratching, no footsteps, just silence. We started to think maybe the man had left, but then we heard something that made my blood run cold, the sound of the front door creaking open. He was inside. We could hear him moving around downstairs, opening drawers and cabinets. Sarah grabbed a baseball bat from the corner of the room, and I held onto a heavy book, ready to fight if we had to. But then we heard him start coming up the stairs. Each step creaked under his weight, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. He stopped outside the door, and we heard him try the handle. When it didn't open, he started knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. We didn't say a word, we just sat there, frozen in fear. After what felt like an eternity, we heard him walk back downstairs. A few minutes later, we heard the front door close, and then everything was silent again. We stayed in that room until the sun came up, too scared to move. When we finally worked up the courage to go downstairs, we found the front door wide open and muddy footprints on the floor. Nothing was missing, but the entire house felt wrong, like it had been violated. We packed up our stuff and left as fast as we could. When we told Sarah's grandparents what happened, they called the police, but they never found the man. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted. But I do know this, we never went back to that cabin again. I used to work the late shift at a 24-hour gas station off a quiet highway. It wasn't a busy place. Most of the time, I'd sit behind the counter, staring at the security cameras, trying to stay awake. The occasional truck driver or night owl would come in, but otherwise, it was just me and the hum of the fluorescent lights. One night, around 2 a.m., a man walked in. Something about him immediately felt off. He was tall, unshaven, wearing an old dirty jacket. He didn't go straight to the drinks or snacks like most customers. Instead, he just stood in the doorway for a few seconds, staring at me. Then, without saying a word, he started walking down the aisles. I tried to shake off the uneasiness and went back to watching the cameras. That's when I noticed something strange. He wasn't looking at the shelves. He was looking at the security cameras. Every time he passed one, he would glance up, as if making sure they were working. Then, he disappeared behind one of the aisles, where I couldn't see him anymore. Minutes passed. I started feeling nervous. He hadn't come up to the counter, hadn't grabbed anything. He was just gone. The store wasn't big enough for someone to hide, but he wasn't on the cameras anymore. My stomach tightened. I cleared my throat and called out, "Sir, do you need help with something?" Silence. I stood up, trying to get a better view of the store. That's when I heard it. The softest shuffle of feet coming from behind the shelf closest to the counter. He was standing there, just out of my sight. My heart started pounding. Something told me not to move. I kept my hands on the counter, pretending to look at the register. My mind was racing. Should I call the police? But for what? A feeling. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him slowly peek around the corner of the shelf, just enough so that one of his eyes was visible. He wasn't browsing. He wasn't shopping. He was watching me. I forced myself to stay calm. "Do you need something?" I asked, my voice as steady as I could make it. For a moment, he didn't move. Then very slowly, he grinned. Not a friendly grin. Something else. Something that sent a chill straight down my spine. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and walked out the door. Without a word, I exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath. I watched him through the windows as he stepped off the curb and into the darkness of the parking lot. But he didn't get into a car. He just stood there, at the edge of the lot, facing the gas station, staring. I locked the doors. My hands were shaking. I didn't take my eyes off him, but I also didn't want to look directly at him. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, he started walking away, disappearing into the night. I didn't sleep when I got home that morning. The next night, I asked my coworker if he had ever seen the guy before. He frowned and shook his head, but then he pulled out his phone, showing me a news article from a few months ago. A grainy security photo showed a man who looked almost exactly like him, a drifter, suspected in a string of disappearances along highways in our state. I called the police, but they didn't find anything. No trace of him, just an empty parking lot and a few blurry security camera images. I don't know what would have happened if I had stepped away from the counter that night, and I don't think I ever want to find out.